If we are to get anything from today's reading, which is useful for us in 2020, I think we need to put it, first of all, into context. And the context was Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was a complex city. It was cosmopolitan, it was small, it was a capital city, and it was the capital of a small country which was under the rule of a great empire. So it was a garrison city. And the Roman army was not composed mostly of Romans. It was composed of just as diverse a selection of nations as NATO is today, and speaking as many languages. So that was the basis of cosmopolitanity. And then there was the fact that the Jews were the greatest trading nation, really for a very, very long time. They had the Jewish diaspora started long before Jerusalem was vacated. And there were people right round the Mediterranean coast, speaking many languages, all of them Jews. We hear about them, do we not, at the time of the when Peter spoke to the crowd. You remember, the crowd said, "We all hear your friends speaking in our own languages." So that's how it was. It was a place of tensions. The centers of power were, well, the main center was, in fact, apart from the garrison, was the priesthood. And they exercised control of belief of a in great detail. It was a complex religion that they were imposing or supervising. And then there was the Sanhedrin with its 73 judges, and there were the elders. It was also a porous city. It could take in a huge number of visitors, and they flowed in and out of the city as a tide flows in and out of a harbor, or of Venice, if it comes to that. But every seafaring town has a harbor, and the harbor in this town was the temple, and in particular the court of the Gentiles, because that was the only place where anybody but an Orthodox Jew could worship their God. And worship consisted in a considerable part of providing sacrifices. And if your sacrifice was a dove, it wasn't too much trouble to get it from the other end of Judea or Galilee. You could walk your 50 miles with it in a basket and look after it on the way. But if it was a sheep or a heifer or a bull, you had two problems. One was actually getting it there, which was slow and expensive, and it might be damaged en route. And if it was in any way imperfect, it would be turned down, and then you would have to take it away again and buy something. So the sensible thing to do was to buy your sacrifice, and in the court of the Gentiles, which extended to 7 acres in extent, and also was a shortcut to other parts of the town, you had sacrifices for sale, anything from a cow to a pigeon. Pigeons were very popular as the sort of small currency of sacrifice, and they were sold by people on benches. The larger animals were in pens. And the nasty shock was you expected it to be expensive, but when you got there, they wouldn't take your money. You had to go to the money changers to get the temple currency. and that was expensive too. So there was a tension between the worshipping public and the clergy, as it were. This is the atmosphere in which Jesus came into the town. Now, the priests were expecting him because they'd had their tabs on him from some time. They knew that he was preaching something which would undermine their authority, and so they were on their guard. But when he turned up with a small army of jubilant, happy supporters, calling him Son of David, which was the next thing to being the next king. So that alerted the Sanhedrin as well, and indeed the elders. And the town, as we are told in the New Testament, was in a ferment as a result. And they swept into the court of the Gentiles, and Jesus proceeded to cleanse it. Now, I don't want to go into a lot of detail on that because you know it, but he drove out the people with the sacrifices, the big ones and the small ones. He tipped over the money changers' tables, and he set out then on a sort of festival of healing, particularly of the blind and the lame. Those, I think, are brought to our attention because it was so obvious when somebody can see or somebody can walk for the first time in years. That is to be noticed. But there were many other healings as well, and I don't doubt many of mental illness as well as physical illness. He withdrew then and returned. The priests could do nothing about it because of the numbers. The following day he returned, and the priest immediately came up to him and said, by what authority you are doing these extraordinary things? That was their frontal attack. And Jesus parried it by saying, well, I'll tell you whose authority I act on if you will tell me whose authority you think John the Baptist acted on. And they then were completely silenced because they knew that if they said it was God's authority, the crowd would cheer and say, then why didn't you support his baptizing? And if they said, on the other hand, that it was his own authority, then as they had, all the country people coming in particular, had been baptized already, they would have been angry about that. So they said, well, we can't actually answer that just for the moment. And Jesus said, then neither will I. And then he said, I will tell you a story, a parable. And he tells the story of the unjust tenants, the wicked tenants, who murdered or bullied or maimed the messengers from the landlord, the absentee landlord, and how when the landlord naively sent his son saying, they'll respect him, they killed him to receive the inheritance. Now, before I go on, I must explain that the quotation which Jesus gives in the parable of the rock that was rejected, the stone that was rejected by the masons and became the headstone, that is a quotation from Psalm 118, and it concerns, as it concerns a stone and a key role in it, what the hearers, the educated hearers, and in particular the priests, will be reminded of is another stone, which comes in the dream of Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2 of Daniel. And very briefly, there is a statue. Its head is of gold, its torso is of silver, the loins are of bronze, and the feet are of a mixture of clay and iron. And in the dream, a rock fell on those feet, and it powdered the feet, and then the rest of the statue fell down on the rock and was powdered as well, and all blown away like chaff. And that is what they are being reminded of when Jesus says that that is the rock, and all who fall on it, all who are fallen on will be turned to dust, and so will all who fall on it. And then he goes on to refer to the Son of Man And the priests realized that he's talking about them. They were the ones who had killed the prophets. They were the ones who were going, they didn't yet know, but they would like to think that they could, were going to kill him. Now, what I want to ask you is, how did the priests manage, and I dare say the Sanhedrin as well, how did they manage to convince that crowd to scream for Jesus's execution before the crucifixion? Does that seem to us altogether straightforward? And the answer is that what the population of Israel, of Jerusalem, had been living in was a sort of home they'd built for themselves in the form of the law and the traditions and the customs set up in the framework of the temple and the Sanhedrin and the elders, and under the aegis of the Roman Empire. That was the way people had been living for a very long time. It was home, it was what they were used to. And when this ebullient preacher came in with this jubilant crowd talking about something which the intellectuals there recognized as a direct threat to the status quo, home was threatened. And that is what the crowd was defending. And I wanted to try to empathize with that. And I draw a parallel with the Boers of South Africa who set up apartheid. And once it was set up and lived under for a generation or so, or rather less, it had been founded on separatist traditions of many centuries. It was what the white people had been used to and the black people had lived under for generations. And what astonishes me, or astonished me until I start thinking through this setup with the parable that we've been thinking about, is that the Dutch Reformed Church was entirely content with apartheid, and they were genuinely Christian people. And that is, to us, amazing. It was partly colleagues of mine bringing members of the Dutch Reformed Church to the National Prayer Breakfast at Westminster for a number of years that began to show the Dutch Reformed Church what actually was going on in their own country as seen by other people. And why is that relevant to us now? It's relevant because of the Black Lives Matter movement, which for many people came to as a shock that it should apply in this country as well as America. But if I can just relate two things to you, what brought it to me home severely here was firstly wait a minute. Well, the second thing that came to me was when we had those recent and repeated reports of a black lawyer being kept out of a court in which she was due to defend her client, who was also black, and the automatic way in which the court staff thought that this is a black lady, she can't possibly be coming into the courtroom. And no, I'm just having a complete blackout. Oh yes, the much more terrible thing was revealed in a sermon preached by a member of my daughter's home, one of my daughter's home churches, which gave the account of her experience of what it's like in this country if you are black and not in an important position. and ended up by telling us of the son of a friend of hers in his late teens, I think he was about 20 actually, who was in a young offenders institution in the Midlands and who was set on by 7 of the warders, the officers, and killed, accidentally no doubt. And there have been inquiries, but there has never been a conviction of anybody for the death of that boy. And it didn't hit the national press. Now, that is what our mini apartheid is. And so, as a church, I think we have to look at our society, and it's the function of a church to look at its society and reform itself and the society. And that is what Christ, after all, was doing himself. And I think with the crowd, with Jesus, we can be jubilant in that we don't have to live by complex theological laws, but by loving God with all our hearts and loving our neighbors as ourselves. That is the basis of our religion. And it is wonderful to be with you, brothers and sisters, in that kingdom today.